So you want to know more about the LDS succession crisis. Whereas the succession system within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is now well established that whenever the president and prophet dies, the longest serving member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles then almost immediately becomes the next president, that had not always been the case. And in fact, it was shrouded in contestation for much of the first century. It wasn't until Wilford Woodruff's death in the late 1890s that there was a clear and quick succession. But when people talk about the succession crisis, they're often talking about 1844, when Joseph Smith died and there was a clamoring over who should succeed him. So in this video, as part of my Friday series of So You Want to Know More About X, I want to introduce you to some of the most important historiographical works on the topic of the 1844 succession crisis. Let's dig in. But before we get into the particular crisis of 1844, I do at least want to introduce the broader topic of Mormon schisms, because without understanding the larger tradition of disputes over prophetic succession and dissension and restoration, the 1844 crisis might seem like an outlier. But in reality, Mormonism from its very beginning has been a tradition rife with dissension and schisms. Within the very first year of the Church of Christ, as it was originally called, being founded, there were already competing claimants to leadership positions. The best chronicler of what I call the broader Mormon diaspora, the many different traditions that trace their roots back to Joseph Smith, was Steve Shields, who was raised LDS and then converted to what was then the RLDS tradition, later Community of Christ. And he has written 5 editions of Divergent Paths of the Restoration. The most recent edition, the 5th edition, published by Signature Books just a couple years ago in 2 volumes. And in these 2 volumes, he traces over 400 different expressions of Mormonism that in some way tie their authority back to Joseph Smith. It's a phenomenal resource that I strongly recommend. You can get a virtual copy on Kindle or Apple Books. If you want another general overview of these various succession claims, especially with a focus on the 1844 crisis and its many legacies, I also strongly recommend the edited volume by Newell Bringhurst and John Hamer, Scattering the Saints, Schism Within Mormonism, published by John Whitmer Books about a decade and a half ago. So with that broader context, let's talk about how 1844 was a particularly poignant moment of Mormon schism. By the way, if you enjoy this type of analysis, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I try to provide deep dives on particular historical topics every Monday. I connect history to the present on Wednesdays, and on Fridays, like in this video, I pull back the curtains and talk about the historical work that will allow you too to become an expert on these topics. All right, that's enough throat clearing. Let's get into 1844. The historian who really put in the legwork to challenge traditional understandings of the succession crisis being a fait accompli and always being established, and showing the variety of different options, was D. Michael Quinn. I've actually done a previous video on Quinn and the excellent work he did on post-manifesto polygamy and the origins of fundamentalism, and I may do future videos on him because he casts a long and complicated shadow over Mormon culture and Mormon history. But while he was still a graduate student, a PhD candidate at Yale University, shortly after he had already worked in Leonard Arrington's history division in the church history department, he wrote an article that was published by BYU Studies, the church's own scholarly journal, titled The Mormon Succession Crisis of 1844. It drew from his dissertation work, and in many ways the arguments would eventually be found in his Mormon hierarchy series. In this article, he traces out 8 potential succession methods that Joseph Smith had given at least some validity to during his 14 years as LDS president. In other words, it was far from determined that any one of these would be the clear succession pattern. The first option was the first presidency counselor, that someone within the all-powerful governing first presidency would be the next person to take on that executive position. Obviously, the person who was pushing that was Sidney Rigdon, one of the first counselors placed in the first presidency. However, this first presidency position had evolved over the 14 years, and by the Nauvoo period, Sidney Rigdon had lost a bit of his luster, both in the public mind and in his relationship with Joseph Smith, which meant the first presidency was not as powerful as it once was. The second potential line was by special appointment, meaning that Joseph Smith's revelations and Joseph Smith's own teachings seem to imply that he could just appoint someone who is going to be his successor. And at one point, he did this in 1834, appointing David Whitmer, one of the original members and one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, as his own successor. But of course, David Whitmer eventually leaves the church, even though David Whitmer is going to continue to claim that he has that special mantle all the way to his death, and he ends up leading a small schismatic group of Mormons decades after Joseph Smith dies. And then there are others who are also going to claim a special appointment from Joseph Smith, whether that be James Strang, who I'll talk about more, or Alpheus Cutler. And the Cutlerite movement is one of the most fascinating of these schismatic groups within the faith. A third potential succession option was the associate president, related to, though distinct from, the first presidency. Joseph Smith appointing someone to be an associate or assistant president, seemingly next in line, the next powerful position. Oliver Cowdery being the first person to hold that position, but then that position goes to Hyrum Smith in Nauvoo. And most people agree that Joseph Smith believed that Hyrum Smith was supposed to be his successor. And that's because Hyrum had another potential line. The fourth potential route, according to D. Michael Quinn, was the presiding patriarch. This idea of a patriarchal religion, that patriarch is going to have extra power. Hyrum Smith takes that position, inherited from his father, Joseph Smith Sr. And then after Hyrum dies, William Smith, Joseph and Hyrum's younger brother, also becomes a church patriarch, and he's going to use that position to claim church authority. Then there is a new council established in Joseph Smith's final few months, the Council of 50, which many who participated believed that new theocratic government in embryo was also the highest ecclesiastical power. And one of the more senior members of that council, Lyman White, who is also an apostle, is going to eventually critique Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 for operating beyond their capacity and taking authorities that were reserved for the Council of 50. Then we get to the sixth potential route, according to D. Michael Quinn, which was the Quorum of the 12 and Brigham Young. Now, when originally established in the 1830s, the Quorum of the 12 was to preside over the church outside its headquarters. But in Nauvoo, they start taking on bigger and bigger importance, which is what's going to place Brigham Young, by the Nauvoo period, the president of the Quorum of the 12, in a position to make that claim. And of course, later on, this becomes a cemented form of succession within the LDS Church. The seventh potential route, according to Quinn, were presiding priesthood councils, especially the local councils. When the Quorum of the 12 was originally established in 1835, they had authority for the church outside headquarters, and the High Council had authority at headquarters. And so some believe that that division should continue in Nauvoo, which is why some, including Emma Smith, seem to believe that William Marks, as the stake president, the head of the Nauvoo State High Council, meant that he should be the church authority. And then the eighth and final potential option was a descendant of Joseph Smith, someone within the Smith family. It was clear that Joseph Smith believed his family had a special role within the restoration of the gospel. Joseph Smith III was supposed to be groomed for church leadership, and Joseph was also giving prophecies about a son yet to be born, who would be born several months after Joseph Smith's death, David Hyrum Smith, who seemed to also have a significant role in the future of LDS governance. So it is clear Joseph Smith had a variety of potential options, that all of which had some credibility when looking at Joseph Smith's teachings and revelations. So to put it simply, there's a lot of ambiguity over who should succeed Joseph Smith when he died in 1844 when he was killed by a mob in Carthage jail. Let me run down some of the key questions in the next few months following June 27, 1844. First, I want to emphasize that it was not clear when he died what the saints should do. There was a lot of questioning. Wilford Woodruff, when he returned to Nauvoo a few weeks later, wrote that the saints were like a sheep without a shepherd. Now, Sidney Rigdon tried to take advantage. He was in Pittsburgh at the time of Joseph Smith's death. He was trying to claim residency so he could run on the presidential ticket with Joseph Smith. Remember, in the American Constitution, the president has to be from one state and the vice president has to be from a different state. So if Joseph Smith was claiming Illinois on the presidential ticket, Sidney Rigdon needed to claim another state. So he was trying to claim his home state of Pennsylvania. Now, he returned and he immediately tried to collect followers to appoint him as what he called the church's guardian. His argument would be that Joseph Smith still was leading the church from beyond the grave, and he would remain the counselor to Joseph Smith like he had in life. The problem with Sidney Rigdon's argument, however, was that he had lost a bit of public prestige. He had had a falling out with Joseph Smith during the Nauvoo years. In fact, that falling out can be dated back to the 1830s after he got what appears to be a serious concussion and brain damage after being tarred and feathered. He was pretty unstable, unreliable, and Joseph didn't really see him as crucially as he had before. And while Sidney Rigdon was trying to marshal support, it was during that time that the Quorum of the 12 returned from their electioneering missions. Most of the apostles were away campaigning for Joseph Smith's presidency, and so they returned in late July and early August after they had heard the news. And I do want to emphasize that they had no role in Joseph Smith's death. I know there has been a bit of a growing conspiracy that tries to say that Carthage was an inside job. There is no historical evidence that backs that up. So let me just put that clear. But what Brigham Young did want to do was take advantage of this new climate where it was not clear who the next leader was going to be. Now the Quorum of the 12 had been receiving more authority and more responsibility during the Nauvoo period. After they returned from their very successful British mission, Joseph Smith announced that the Quorum of the 12 was no longer going to be a council that had duties outside of church headquarters like they had during the 1830s, but now that they were going to have an authoritative role within church headquarters. And he started giving the Quorum of the 12 a lot more responsibility, including introducing them to polygamy and the temple rights. And that's why Brigham Young felt the authority to now push for the church's leadership claims, which came to a head on August 8, 1844. You see, it was at a public event in the grove near the temple that Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon squared off. Sidney Rigdon spoke in the morning and Brigham Young spoke in the afternoon, basically both making their claim to the church. And by the way, it wasn't until very recently that Lejeune Carruth, an LDS church historian who has learned Pitman shorthand, was able to decode the notes of what Sidney Rigdon spoke in the morning. Now, Brigham Young then spoke in the afternoon. This is a crucial moment in LDS history that later comes to be known as the Transfiguration of Brigham Young, because later accounts claim that Brigham Young, while speaking, took on the appearance of Joseph Smith, which was a divine approval, a divine manifestation that he was supposed to succeed Joseph Smith in church authority. The problem is there weren't any contemporary accounts. Those accounts come much later. If you want a good overview of that controversy, one of my favorite historical overviews, though written from a Brigham Young biased perspective, is Ronald Walker's article, 6 Days in August, Brigham Young and the Succession Crisis of 1844, which really lays out the historical events and sequencing in what I think a fair way. If you want to see the faith-promoting framing that emphasizes that these accounts of the Transfiguration can be trusted, you can look at the volume produced by BYU Studies titled Opening the Heavens. But if you want a critical dissection of those accounts, showing that it was later created as a myth to buttress Brigham Young's claim, Richard Van Wagoner's article, The Making of a Mormon Myth, the 1844 Transfiguration of Brigham Young, is quite crucial. In reality, my argument, because I wrote a book on Nauvoo, so I had to wrestle with this, my argument was Brigham Young was able to win that fight more due to strategic planning and orchestration. It was also due to context. Many Latter-day Saints by that point knew Brigham Young due to his public role as a missionary and the president over the church's British mission. Nearly half of the saints in Nauvoo were British converts who were already used to recognizing Brigham Young as an authority. They also were aware of Sidney Rigdon's depleted role, that Joseph had no longer trusted him as much. And so Brigham Young was able to take advantage of that public setting, that context, for his claims. He was also able to emphasize his connection to the building of the temple. They were literally in the shadow of the temple while making that claim, and so Brigham Young was able to take advantage of that as well. And finally, I think the big chess piece was when Sidney Rigdon was making his claim to church leadership, he was relying on another counselor in the First Presidency, Amasa Lyman, who I've done a video in the past, who was recently added to the First Presidency. But Lyman ended up supporting Brigham Young, which seemed to be the final stake. And so when they did a vote, a vast majority of Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo supported Brigham Young. Sidney Rigdon was then excommunicated. He left for Pennsylvania with his followers, although there are later schisms within the Sidney Rigdon tradition, in part when he too started introducing polygamy. But the succession crisis was not clearly over yet. Even with Sidney Rigdon vanquished from the perspective of Brigham Young, there was still the issue of the Joseph Smith family. I think it's clear that Joseph Smith believed his family would play a continued role in the church. And the biggest issue was that Emma Smith did not trust Brigham Young. Emma had grown increasingly disenchanted with the direction that Joseph Smith's Mormonism was moving, most notably on polygamy. And the rift between Joseph and Emma in the last year of their life was never fully healed. And Emma saw in Brigham Young someone who was going to perpetuate the worst of the Mormon tradition in her mind, most notably polygamy. It wasn't until just a few months after Joseph Smith's death that Brigham and Heber C. Kimball almost literally divided the 30 or so plural wives of Joseph Smith to be wives of them, that they were going to take over. Almost this marital colonization to prove their position within these anointed secret quorums, that they were taking on the mantle, which even meant being sealed to Joseph Smith's own plural wives. I also think it's not too far-fetched to believe that Brigham might have proposed a similar arrangement to Emma Smith, asking Emma to be sealed to Brigham, that he would take care of her, which Emma would have saw as quite odious. Emma was one problem within the Smith family, but she wasn't the only problem for Brigham Young, because Joseph Smith's brother, William Smith, also believed that the Smith family should remain in control. Now, he gets ordained to be the church patriarch, taking the place of Hyrum Smith, the position that both their fathers, Joseph Smith Sr., had previously held. And remember, in the Michael Quinn article that I laid out at the beginning, the church patriarch was also seen as a potential successor. So by the summer of 1845, William Smith is starting to make claims that maybe he should be in control, not Brigham Young. And there were some rumors that Lucy Mack Smith was supporting her. And in fact, the Quorum of the 12 had to do a lot of efforts to make sure that Lucy Mack Smith did not speak out against Brigham Young. And at the last General Conference of the Church in the fall of 1845, Lucy Mack Smith did speak before the general membership, saying she wished she could move westward with them, which was all the ring of authority and validation that Brigham Young wanted. Meanwhile, William Smith ends up being excommunicated, in part due to his challenges to Brigham Young, in parts due to other schisms. That's a fascinating story in its own right. I think it's also important to remember that Lucy Mack Smith is narrating her own memoir. She is dictating her history to a couple of scribes during the same time, this narrative that ends up becoming known as the history of Joseph Smith, as told by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, which is framed in a way to validate the Smith family role in church leadership, which is why, decades later, when it is published, Brigham Young wanted to burn every copy he could find of that narrative because it was born out of this succession crisis. But even once the Smith family was no longer seen as the primary opponent to Brigham Young or a challenge, that did not mean he was in the clear. As he was preparing the Latter-day Saints to leave Nauvoo, to give up on America, and to move out to what was then northern Mexico, another claimant came in the frame of James J. Strang, a lawyer, a very persuasive orator who had recently converted and claimed that he fit into the category of a special appointment. He claimed that not only did he have a letter from Joseph Smith saying that he was supposed to be Joseph Smith's clear supporter, he also claimed that Joseph Smith visited him as an angel and ordained him. He would go on to say that he had uncovered buried records and that he was revealing new texts from God, in many ways a spiritual mimesis, copying the Joseph Smith playbook, which ended up being quite successful in 1845 and 1846, especially for those Latter-day Saints who were not comfortable with the direction Brigham Young was leading the faith, the introduction of polygamy, and especially the migration westward. The James J. Strang arrived like a comet and took lots of impressive converts, including several of the original witnesses to the Book of Mormon, several key figures in church leadership. The best biography on James J. Strang is Vicky Speaks' God Has Made Us a Kingdom, James Strang and the Midwest Mormons, published by Signature Books. If you want a shorter introduction to these debates, I actually co-wrote an article on the topic with Robin Jensen, a great historian with the Joseph Papers Project. We wrote the article Debating Succession 1846, John E. Page, Orson Hyde, and the Trajectories of Joseph Smith's Legacy, where we try to trace out these different movements and arguments within the Mormon tradition that these debates between the Brighamites and the Strangites represented. And even while Brigham Young was on the trek west, he was still disputing these competing claims over church leadership. It's during that time that Lyman White, an apostle who is claiming that the Quorum of 12 is acting beyond their authority, that it should be the Council of 50, he leads a schism group. There are many who start moving to Strang. There are many others. And even within the LDS tradition, there are many who were upset with how much power and authority Brigham Young was taking, that he was operating in excess to just his position within the Quorum of 12. And those disputes even happened within the Quorum of 12, where people like Orson Pratt denounced Brigham Young for acting like what he called a tyrant. There's one tense meeting between the Quorum of 12 where Orson Pratt told Brigham Young, we need to operate more like a Congress. You are acting as a tyrant. We need to operate like a Congress. To which Brigham Young replied, shit on Congress. I am in control of the church. This ends up culminating in late December of 1847 when Brigham Young is finally appointed the president of the church. That was a 3-year ordeal. So I think this 1844 succession crisis takes many forms, many layers, and many developments. First, who is going to lead the church? How is the church going to be led? And Brigham Young's eventual appointment to president and prophet of the church in December of 1847 was never fully preordained when you look at the historical record. We still need a good history, a good book that overviews the Mormon succession crisis of 1844, starting with the death of Joseph Smith, to December of 1847, when Brigham Young is appointed the prophet, priest, and king, and president of the LDS tradition. The closest we have to capturing these dynamic disputes, I would argue, is John Turner's wonderful biography, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, that I always recommend. I hope this video was useful. I might do videos in the future on specific topics, but this is providing at least a historiographical background so that you can go do the reading and that you can become an expert on this very fascinating topic. Share and like this video if you found it useful. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. History has never been more relevant. It's also never been more interesting because these topics can disrupt our traditional understandings and mean a lot in our present day setting. So here's to more conversations like it.